Hey friends, how's it going? It's the last day in Leviticus. Fun stuff. If you thought I'm glad this is over, well, wait till we get to Numbers tomorrow. Hopefully, though, you thought, wow, there's still a lot here that I don't understand, but there's a lot that I didn't used to understand, but now I do. And as I've said again and again as a refrain, the details can be hard, but are we grasping more of the big picture of at least some of what's communicated here of what God is doing in this in these passages of scripture? So I've decided. I think I'm committed to do a sermon series coming up here before too long on the book of Leviticus. Not a verse by verse, but maybe I don't know, somewhere between 3 weeks and 6 weeks, kind of walking through some of the big themes of Leviticus, such that if we get that, we'll get a lot of the gist of what's going on at this part of the Bible at this point through the story. I want to do a book recommendation. I make a few along the way, and I'm going to try to tell you who I think books are for when I make book recommendations. I guess that's one advantage to doing these videos. Often I can share more things in that way to people who are hopefully interested. But this, how to read the Bible book by book. Apparently they're coming out with a new version of this year that's a separate book for the Old Testament and for the New Testament. I'm not sure how different it's going to be, but this is nice because it's one volume for the whole Bible. And it has about, excuse me, 4 to 6 pages for each book of the Bible, just really giving you a overview. Maybe 6, 8 pages. I don't know, somewhere between 6 and 8 pages for a book of the Bible, at least for something like Leviticus. This will be a good resource as you're reading through the Bible, if you would like to, as we jump into a new book every couple of weeks, more or less, depending on how long the books are. Will give you some kind of orienting data for that. So it's a book I just recommend that everybody that's a student of Scripture considers having on their shelves. How to read the Bible book by book. Not a book that you'll sit down and read through, but a reference book that you can pull off the shelf and look at. So I mentioned that. So again, I'm just going to share some thoughts for how long, right? Who knows? But some thoughts through, and I'm going to look at some things from the last 3 days of the reading. So this is hopefully not going to be the regular time times 3. Actually, Friday was the day I wanted to talk about some of these things, and I just got into some other stuff. And again, I'll be here fairly regularly, but I'm not promised to be here every day. So if something comes up in life, I'm not going to say, oh, I have to leave this great conversation to go home and do a video. I will miss days here and there, but I will hopefully do more days than not. If I go on vacation, I'm not going to do it on vacation, probably at some point. So we'll just kind of see what happens here along the way. So chapter 17, I don't want to say too much about. Just again, if we had short sections, I would talk about everything, but we don't. This is interesting, though. Again, so much backdrop for so many New Testament things, and I'll try to mention some of those things even today, where we'll see things that are very important in the Gospels come from here, are founded here in these chapters of Leviticus. In chapter 18, a lot of it is about different sexual relationships that are off limits. So it's given some detail on that. And remember, this is not just a religious, if you will, document. These people at this time were a nation in every sense of the term. They were becoming a nation. So this is both theologically and how they operate as a society, everything. As things change, right? We live in different places now. So this was a theocracy. God kind of said, here's how everything's going to run. We don't live in that kind of society or culture anymore. And yet we want to discern what we can learn here from this, right? Look at chapter 18, verse 21. And this will give us an idea of kind of what was going on in the world around them. And it's really one of those things that is important for us to understand, because we sort of think sometimes certain things that are going on here seem kind of regressive to us, like slavery instructions, etc. That is hard to get our minds around, and we kind of are looking back from where we're at, and we're saying, wow, that seems kind of odd to us. But really what we should be doing in a sense is going back and looking at where are they coming out of, what are their cultures around them doing, and then we can see the differences from that starting point, kind of where God is bringing people along this journey. And remember, this is a point in time. It's significant. There's things that we're going to learn here that are enduring, but it's taking people from one place to another, and that's always what God is doing, right? That's discipleship, taking you from here to there. Some things are going to get addressed right away. Other things are over the course of time. I'm going to teach you how this works, and so this is the journey of God meeting us where we're at. He found them in Egypt, rescued them, and now he's teaching them a way of life. But I say that to say this. In chapter 18, verse 21, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So that to us is like, well, what? That's a temptation. But that's something that people were doing. Things like child sacrifice, right? As crazy as that is, the fact that that would even have to be stated. Along with certain of the instructions here, like not having sex with animals, ought to be fairly obvious, but in this case, not so much, right? Okay, so let's look at a couple things that are really interesting as we move forward. At least to me, I'm just kind of picking out some things, not because they're necessarily more important. But just because I want to mention them because they're interesting. In chapter 19, verse 9, we have this instruction on gleaning. Do not reap the harvest of your field. When you reap the harvest of your field, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am your God. Why the foreigner? The foreigner, because they didn't own land. Like the land was allotted when they go into the promised land. The land's allotted to the different tribes and their clans, etc. And so people that come in from other places or come with them aren't given land of their own, but they still, as we'll see here, need to be cared for and provided for. But this provision for the poor and others among them is interesting because it's still involved. We talk about how do we help people who need help, and really the interesting thing here is that it still gives people agency. The poor still have to go and work in a sense. They have to go to the fields and go around and collect food for them to eat. Now they didn't plant it. It's not their field. So it's the commanded generosity of God to do this. But again, the point being, it's not just about you. It's about us, about the whole community, and looking out for one another. This is something that we sometimes can get lax on in our not following this law per se, but the idea of how do we make provision for those who have needs among us in a way that still gives them dignity and still gets them engaged, not just passively receiving, but actively receiving generosity from others as we sort of care for one another. So this is important foundation, of course, right when we get to the book of Ruth, where we'll be before too long. We get to Ruth. This is the background for the practice that Ruth does, and so we'll see this in action in Ruth and how it works. But this is the backdrop for that. Now if somebody didn't do this, would anybody be able to prove it or no? Maybe not. But it shows when we get to Ruth, right, with Boaz, his character and his faithfulness to God, that he does it. And of course, with Ruth, he goes above and down. But we'll save that for when we get to that, right? Going down a little bit. Look at chapter 19. Look at verse 17. I have little flags here. I marked some stuff. It's a good thing, by the way, if you want to come back to something, get these little Post-it flags and put them in your Bible to come back to or to know, and then you can just pull them out. They don't damage anything. Verse 17, chapter 19. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so that you will not share in their guilt. Isn't this an interesting idea as well, too? That if you see somebody in the community, your neighbor, if you see someone doing wrong, your responsibility is to approach them about it. And this really comes forward into the Gospels so well in certain teachings. Again, I'm not going to just go there just because of the amount of time that it takes, but it's going to be so interesting to continue to see how these Old Testament foundations carry through in the teaching of Jesus in other places as we move forward. But again, here but gently, yeah, that'll come forward. In particular, in the New Testament, we'll have some specific things about that, right? Because it's as Jesus will say, treat others the way you want to be treated, right? So if frankly, I mean, if I am doing something that I don't see, or I'm kind of whatever about it, as somebody who wants to grow, I want to be informed of that, but I don't want to be treated harshly, right? To the comment that you just made, Devin. I want you to be gentle with me, and so I would hope I would do the same thing for you. But it's fascinating that we, again, so much of this kind of checks or challenges our kind of American individualism, where it's sort of like, well, if I didn't do anything wrong, I can't be held responsible. Well, no, that's not entirely it in this kind of biblical way of thinking. We're a part of something, a community bigger than ourselves. And so we, back to Cain and Abel, we are our brother's keeper in a sense. And so that it invites us into kind of a deeper way of thinking. Again, not about judging others, but about this desiring for the whole community, which would, in the sense today, we can't carry this straightforward, would be the church as the community of God's people, to challenge each other, because this responsibility to be and become holy is still our one of our major things that we're after. So, okay, so get this, the next verse 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Where is that familiar from? Oh, okay. So this now is really important. This place that may seem obscure, right in the middle of teaching in Leviticus, when Jesus is asked, Matthew 22, 37 through 40, being the one that I have memorized, the reference I have memorized. What is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your hearts. We'll see that in Deuteronomy very soon. Jesus says, this is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in that text in Matthew, if you look down on your footnote, you know what you'll see? Leviticus 19:18. This is the this is what Jesus says is the second, is right there with its first commandment. Um, love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul and others will say things like love fulfills the law. So this is the law, what we're in right now. And so sometimes we have statements that kind of cut through all the detail to big picture explanation. This is one of those things. So love your neighbor as yourself. Really important, right? Really important stuff. So that's interesting. Stuff to follow there about 2 kinds of seed, 2 kinds of clothing in your fabric, 2 types of material in your fabric. I think, I've not dug into this really deep yet, but I think the idea is we're not to have a mixed identity. We're supposed to be wholly focused on being God's people, not being kind of 1 foot here, 1 foot in the world, so to speak, but but focused in as God's people. Okay, end of chapter 19. Look at verse 33. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. Right? So the tendency sometimes is when somebody who's not kind of part of our core group is there, we can mistreat them in various ways, perhaps. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born, right? They're not, but it's saying you don't treat them as less than, even though they're not part of the family, right? They're not part of the 12 tribes by descent and all that. You still treat them well. How do you treat them? Love them as yourself. Okay, so interestingly, we just saw, again, your fellow Israelites, love your neighbor as yourself. The foreigner residing among your land, love them as you love yourself. So this, again, if we fast forward, think about Jesus in like the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Who's my neighbor? What Jesus is doing there, is it new? I mean, maybe in a way, but it's kind of founded right here, right? And so, we can see some consistency here following through in the biblical story. More in chapter 20 about Molech. We stay away from that guy, that god, and all idols and stuff too, but that's particular insidious. And we have, so like in 20 verse 7, again, sometimes in the midst of these various instructions and laws, etc., there's just these summary statements that kind of pop in again and again at times, just to remind us. Verse 7, consecrate yourself, set yourself aside, and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. Okay, so this is what God is doing. He's shaping a people through these instructions. Is the idea, at least in part, right? To become a people who are holy with the W, holy His, and holy with an H. So okay. At the end of chapter 20, verse 22. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them so that why? So that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. How's that for a graphic expression, right? So it's almost like this idea that, and we see, remember, was it back in Genesis where God said that the sin of the Amorites, I think, has not yet reached its fullness, or something like that. But the idea being that people can be so corrupt, people, that the land itself kind of like wants rid of them. Like, get these people out of here. I don't want. So this image, right, of the land vomiting up or spitting out, right? It goes. We think of Revelation, the church at Laodicea, right? It's different, but again, this idea of vomiting out. Verse 23, again, more specifically, You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. And so probably more of the things in the law here in Leviticus that are confusing to us. Some of it's just because it's confusing, but some of it maybe is likely because that these are practices that are going on in the idolatrous cultures around them, and God is wanting to put in all kinds of things that will separate His people from the influence, the peer pressure, if you will, at this point in their infancy as a people, to keep away those bad influences, and to keep them separate from those people so that they can be formed. And then ultimately, throughout the story, the goal is to go out like the Great Commission, right? But we need to be formed before we can go out. Otherwise, when we're little kids, we're going to, if you will, in the faith, right? We're going to be influenced too much by others, and they're going to have their way. Instead of us making disciples of them, they're going to make disciples of us. And we've seen that happen often, right? You are not to live, verse 23, not to live according to the customs of nations that would drive up before you, because they did all these things, I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations, right? To be a special, a holy people, a kingdom of priests. Ultimately, remember the promise to Abraham, ultimately to bless those nations or to draw them in, but not yet. Not right now. We're not at that. We're not ready for that yet. Verse 25. Therefore, you must make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, between clean and unclean birds. So again, the point of so much of this is to shape them as a people. It's not about God hates certain animals and likes certain other ones, or it's not even about, we sometimes say, oh, it's about God knows what's healthy and what's not healthy. I mean, that may be a little part of it, but that's not the main point. The main point is for the people to be separate from those around them, to have different practices, even in the daily things like eating food. Verse 26, again, because we see instructions and then these big summary statements. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Very important stuff. All right, so chapter 23 and following is the festival cycle. The calendar is now being, well, we've seen a lot of this already introduced, but now it's kind of summarized in one place. These festivals, the calendar, the events that God wanted them to practice each year, from the Sabbath to the various festivals, through that. So that's some things that we should be familiar with, because they'll continue on in the story as it goes on. And then I want to mention just one or two other things. Let me end with this in chapter 25, the year of Jubilee. So again, these things are, if we don't understand these events, the festivals, and the calendar, we're not going to understand, like, again, when we move forward, like, Jesus's sacrifice happens at Passover. Pentecost is not a new thing. It's an existing part of the Jewish calendar, that something new happens, but on that particular day. There's reasons why people are in Jerusalem. So it's so cool that we're doing this read through the Bible thing, because we're going to see things build on each other. But we need to, guys, not rush past these things. We need to try to stop and understand them. It would be really beneficial if you could do things like stop and recount what the major sacrifices, offerings are in the book of Leviticus. If you could do a drawing from memory of the tabernacle and what the major piece, or the the organization, the pieces of furniture, and there's not a lot to understand that, because it's going to help you as you go forward to be able to list out some of these festivals. Let's be students. It's not about getting through it. Are we understanding more? That's the question. Not everything. Not do I understand every detail, but do I understand some of the big picture pieces of Leviticus and the biblical story? Because if we don't get our foundation right, we're not going to understand what's going on as we kind of build this thing, right? As we move forward. So here's an interesting thing. This year of Jubilee. So this every 50 years, the land goes back to its. This is not like our culture. You don't just buy and sell a house that you like, kind of casually. They had land that was their land, and look, honestly, I could get into a lot of things about how, economically and things. It's hard how we, when we don't have, ownership and these kind of things, and when we rent, we're at the whatever. There's so much there, and it goes beyond my expertise. But in any case, what I do know is that here, if you were poor and you had to sell your property, they would sell it doing the math such that whatever the time was to this and the year of Jubilee was set. It wasn't 50 years wasn't a 50-year mortgage. It was whenever the set date was, you kind of borrowed, if you will, enough with the understanding that when that year of Jubilee hits, you're back. So if I have this house, and if my house was part of this deal, my property, if I was poor, I lost my job, I lost my crops, whatever, I couldn't afford, I needed money, I could sell it to my neighbor or somebody down the street. But they wouldn't own it for good, right? We would calculate the value based on till the next year of Jubilee, and then I would get it back. So there's no permanent kind of situation here. I think this is really cool. I don't know how it would specifically, if anybody's ever tried to kind of make that work in a modern sense. And again, I'm not sure that the Bible tells us that's what we should do. But in any case, it's interesting how the things are built in here such that people that are in a vulnerable state, whether they're a widow, an orphan, poor, a foreigner in the land, a regular person who's down on their luck for some reason, they're not dealt a permanent blow for generations. Like there's a reset that gets it back. The justice is restorative justice. There's not just go to prison there's no prison. You don't just go to prison for like decades or your life. Either you lose your life because it's really serious, or you make it as right as it can be. So this is a whole, in this case, big picture way of looking at things. All right, I'll wrap up here. We're at just about half an hour. This is in regard to this is an interesting thing though, because sometimes we talk about whose land is it? Promised land. We think about that today in the geopolitics of the Middle East and Israel. This is something to put into the big picture. I don't know that it's the final answer. There'll be more that's said as the Bible goes on here. But look at this, verse 23 of chapter 25. The land must not be sold permanently. We were just talking about that, year of Jubilee, right? Because the land is mine. And you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So God's basically saying, you don't get to make up your own. You don't get to say, this is my property, I'll do with it what I want. God says, no, it's mine. It's my property. I've given it to you to possess, to hold on to be responsible for, but you don't get to decide the rules. God says it's mine. And as we see in the blessings and curses, because it's mine, if you don't follow me, if you don't treat it right, hopefully you read today chapter 26, right? The rewards for obedience and the punishment or the curse for disobedience. It's always God's. and he gives it, but it's not to do what you want. And guys, this is a bigger thing for us still today, right? This is stewardship. Nothing that we have is ours to hoard or to be selfish with, but it's what God has entrusted us to. We have to be responsible with it. We don't just say it's God, so who cares? I'll do whatever I want. No, we're responsible, but to seek what God would want us to do with everything that He's put into our hands, whether it be our ability, the way we treat people, but also the physical things, the finances, the resources around us. And again, as we circle back, we're done with Leviticus for now, but as we circle back to this, these burnt offerings, that and the priest, to kind of the idea that's representative of us being all in, the whole thing given over to God, right, is a lesson or a point about ourselves. We're to be holy, to set apart, to be consecrated, to be God's people, to live as His special people with His special presence. This is not supposed to be a heavy lift. It's supposed to be a blessing. God has chosen us to be the unique people that He, well, them then, but us now in the New Testament sense, right? To be His special people, to be shaped after His will and His character, so that we can be a blessing to the world and invite them. I mean, this is evangelism in a sense, right? The ultimate purpose. It's inviting people to a whole life of knowing God and walking with Him and having all of His promises and living His way. It's all such good stuff. All right. Share your thoughts in the comments. Share your questions. Share where you're at. What did you think about Leviticus as a whole? But hey, we did it. We made it through. And now we're on to Numbers, out of the frying pan and into the fire tomorrow. So have fun, guys. I'll see you soon. Bye.